All right, well then, good morning. I'm David
Good morning.
Reese,
Sorry, everyone.
Chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this virtual meeting of the board. This is the 6th meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2022, and on or before September 30th, 2023. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Christina DeRose.
Present.
Robert Ehrlich.
Present.
Shayla Garcia.
Present.
Christian Gonzalez Rivera.
Present.
Arpit Gupta.
Present.
Alex Schwartz.
Present.
Christina Smith.
Present.
Adon Soltren.
Present.
And David Reese present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. I am pleased to announce that 2 virtual public hearings to comment on the proposed guidelines have been added to our schedule. These virtual public hearings will be held on the following dates and times. On Monday, June 6, 2022, we will have our virtual public hearing from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. and the public can view the meeting via YouTube feed and listen via telephone. And then on Wednesday, June 8th, 2022, we will have our second virtual public hearing. It will be from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. And again, the public can view the meeting via YouTube feed and listen via telephone. If you want to comment on the proposed rule at our virtual public hearings, you can sign up to speak. If there is time at the end of each hearing, after all of those who have registered have been heard, we will hear from other attendees at each virtual meeting. At each virtual hearing. Registration to speak for both hearings will begin tomorrow, May 28th at 9 a.m. You can register online through our website, nyc.gov/RGB, or by email at csuperville, CSUPERVILLE at nycrgb.org, nycrgb.org, or by calling 212-669-7480 from 9 a.m. till 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. Registration will end on June 3rd at 12 p.m. for the June 6th hearing and June 6th at 12 p.m. for the June 8th hearing. Simultaneous Spanish translation will be provided at both hearings. In addition to the virtual hearings, 2 in-person public hearings to comment on the proposed guidelines will be held on the following dates and times. On Monday, June 13th, 2022, we will have an in-person public hearing at the Jamaica Performing Arts Auditorium. It's at 153-10 Jamaica Avenue in Jamaica, New York, 11432. And that hearing is from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. And the public can view the meeting via YouTube feed, but must participate in person. And there's more details about that. I'll give those in a bit. The second in-person hearing is on Wednesday, June 15th, 2022. It will be at the main theater of Hostos Community College, which is a CUNY campus at 450 Grand Concourse, Bronx, New York, 10451. That hearing will be from 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. And the public can also view that meeting via YouTube feed, but must participate in person. Anyone who wants to comment on the proposed rule at a public hearing must sign up to speak. People wishing to speak at the public hearings can pre-register now online through our website, nyc.gov/RGB, or by email at csuperville@nycrgb.org, or you can sign up to speak by calling 212-669-7480 from 9 a.m. till 5 p.m., Monday through Friday. For those who do not pre-register, registration is also available at the public hearings. You can register in person from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. on June 13th, and from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. on June 15th. Please be advised that there are COVID protocols required by both venues. Details can be found on our website or by calling us at 212-669-7480. If you are unable to attend our hearings, you can submit written, audio, and video comments prior to the hearings for the board members' review. Instructions to submit these comments are available on the board's website at nyc.gov/RGB, by email at ask@nycrgb.org, or by calling the RGB at 212-669-7480. The final vote will take place on June 21st, starting at 7:30 p.m. at the Great Hall at Cooper Union. You may attend in person or watch via our YouTube channel. Details on how to attend these meetings can be found on our website in the meetings section. Today, staff will present the 2022 Housing Supply Report, Changes to the Rent Stabilized Housing Stock in New York City in 22 report, and additional income and expense data. All of these reports will be posted on our website and made available to the public, as well as the slides from the staff presentation after today's meeting. Just click research on our homepage to download these documents. After the presentations by the RGB staff, Woody Pascal, HCR Deputy Commissioner for Rent Administration, will be making a presentation to the board members. I will now introduce Danielle, who will be presenting the 2022 Housing Supply Report. Andrew, is there anything you would like to add before we begin?
No, I think we're good.
Thanks. Danielle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just wanted to make one small clarification. The registration for the virtual hearings starts tomorrow, which was said, but tomorrow is May 27th, not May 28th.
Oh,
I just want to make sure everybody knows. And the registration for the in-person public hearings is already open. So if you'd like to register to those, just go to our website, and tomorrow at 9 a.m. the virtual hearing registration will open.
Thanks, Danielle.
Actually, David, you know what? Let me just go on our website and show folks how to sign up for the hearings, if I may, if you can indulge me for a second. I'm sorry, 1 second. So this is our homepage. On our quick links, there's a public hearing registration. Click here. Currently on our site is just the in-person hearings. Like Danielle said, tomorrow, May 27th, we will be at 9 a.m. being posted the form to register for our virtual hearings. So once you get to this page, you just determine whether you want to go to the June 13th or June 15th hearing, and you just walk yourself through the registration. Once again, you can call our office as well if you'd like, or email us to register. There is a public hearing instruction page that's very useful if you plan to testify. Gives you the different things that you need to do in order to testify. The COVID protocols for both venues are up. Those are the protocols that the venues, they're not our protocols for entering the venues. So please read those carefully if you're planning on attending. And that's it. So again, if just going to our homepage, going to quick links, public hearing, once we have the virtual option, it will bring you to choose either the in-person or the virtual. And that was that. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Give me just 1 second to share my screen. I just want to confirm you're just seeing my screen.
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, wait, I don't have my notes. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Give me 1 second. Okay, let me try this again.
All right, we see it, Danielle, just FYI.
Thank you. The rent stabilization law requires the Rent Guidelines Board to consider the overall supply of housing accommodations and overall vacancy rates. Therefore, our research staff produces an annual housing supply report, which highlights year-to-year changes and trends in the supply of residential housing in New York City, with a focus on findings from the 2021 Housing and Vacancy Survey, new construction and demolition data, conversions and subdivisions, cooperative and condominium activity, housing rehabilitation, and government housing programs and funding. The major findings of this year's housing supply report are 19,923 building permits were issued in 2021 for housing units, an increase of 1.8%. In the first quarter of 2022, permits rose by 38.1% as compared to the same quarter of 2021. City-sponsored efforts during 2021 will add or preserve 24,812 housing units to the residential stock, 60% of which are preservation projects, and a decrease in total units of 16% over the prior year. Demolitions increased 9.8% to 1,543 buildings in 2021. There was a 5% increase in the number of residential units in co-op or condo plans approved in 2021 to 4,673 units. And for newly certified units utilizing tax incentives, there was a 3.8% decrease in the number of 421A units to 9,920 units, and an increase of 279.5% in J51 units to 7,362 units. In addition, as of 2021, 9.4% of all rental housing is considered overcrowded, and the citywide rental vacancy rate was 4.54%. Preliminary findings from the 2021 Housing and Vacancy Survey, the periodic survey of the city's housing stock, were released to the public earlier this month. New York City is unique in that a significant share of its housing is renter occupied. The HVS reports more than 2/3 of the city's available housing stock is renter occupied, compared to 36% for the nation as a whole. New York City has almost 2.3 million rental units, and 44% of those are rent stabilized. Vacancy rates also vary by rent regulation status, with the HVS finding the overall rental vacancy rate was 4.54% in 2021. Rent stabilized units had nearly the same vacancy rate as overall rental units, 4.57%, while private non-regulated units were vacant at a 5.29% rate. The HVS also reports on overcrowding rates. The overall rental overcrowding rate was 9.4% in 2021. Rent stabilized units were overcrowded at a rate of 13.1%, while private non-regulated units were overcrowded at a 7.2% rate. As this pie chart illustrates, as of 2021, the most recent data available via the Housing and Vacancy Survey, about 2/3 of New York City's available housing stock are renter units. The largest share is private, non-regulated rentals at 45%, followed by rent stabilized at 44%, public housing 8%, and other regulated units 2%. Rent controlled units made up just 1% of the overall rental housing stock. Examining the number of building permits issued annually helps to determine the amount of new housing planned each year. Permit approvals for new housing units in 2021 increased by 1.8% to 19,923, following a 26% decrease in the prior year. In 2021, permits fell in Queens, down 30% to 4,087 units, and also fell in Staten Island, down 24% to 310 permits. However, permits rose in the other boroughs, including Brooklyn, up 3.1% to 7,013 units, the Bronx up 15.5% to 5,348 units, and by the greatest proportion in Manhattan, up 66.9% to 3,165 units. First quarter 2022 permits, the most recently available data, increased by 38.1% in comparison to the number of permits issued during the first quarter of 2021, despite double-digit decreases in 3 of the 5 boroughs. The Bronx down 29.5%, Manhattan down 67.4%, and Staten Island down 69.3%. But permits issued did increase in Brooklyn and Queens during the first quarter of 2022, up 113.3% and 241.4% respectively. This graph illustrates that 19,923 residential building permits were issued during 2021, an increase of 1.8%, following a decrease of 26% in 2020. While the city overall had a 1.8% increase in permits to 19,923 citywide. This map shows the number of permits by borough in 2021 and the change from 2020. As the map illustrates, the largest proportional increase was in Manhattan, but Brooklyn had the largest share of permits. Permit data can also be analyzed more deeply by looking at the reported size of the buildings receiving permits. In 2021, a total of 876 buildings received permits. Citywide, 17.2% of these buildings were single family, 27.1% were two family, 10.3% were 3 or 4 family structures, and 45.4% were buildings with 5 or more units. As the graph illustrates, almost all building permits in Manhattan were for the largest buildings, while in Staten Island, virtually all permits were for either 1 or 2 family buildings. Building size was more evenly distributed in Queens. Moving on to completions and public construction, the annual housing supply report normally includes data on those housing units that completed construction in the most recent full calendar year. However, completions data is not yet available for 2021. It is expected that the 2023 housing supply report will include both 2021 and 2022 data. New housing is also created by various programs sponsored by the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development and the Housing Development Corporation. These agencies reported 24,812 housing starts in 2021, 60% of which were rehabilitations or preservations, with an overall decrease in starts of 16% over 2020. The 421A program is designed to encourage new construction of multifamily housing. Owners are exempt from paying additional real estate taxes on the increased value of the property due to the new construction. Depending on the iteration of the program, which over its 50-year history has periodically expired and then been renewed by the New York State Legislature, exemptions last for 10 to 35 years, and rental properties must abide by all rent regulations during benefits. The current iteration of the 421A program expires on June 15, 2022, and has not yet been renewed or replaced. For the third consecutive year, the number of units receiving final certificates of eligibility decreased, falling 3.8%. A total of 9,920 units were newly issued final 421A exemptions in 2021, with 53.6% in Brooklyn, 17.6% in the Bronx, 15.2% in Manhattan, and 13.7% in Queens. There were no units in Staten Island. Final certificates of eligibility went down in 3 of the 5 boroughs during 2021, decreasing 49.3% in the Bronx, 36.5% in Queens, and from 73 units to 0 units in Staten Island, but increased 59.6% in Manhattan and 42.7% in Brooklyn. As you can see in this graph, the number of apartment units newly receiving final certification of 421A benefits in 2021 decreased for the third consecutive year by 3.8%. 71% of these units are in Brooklyn and the Bronx. Just less than 40% of New York City's owner-occupied housing is in the form of co-ops and condos. Construction of new co-ops and condos, which increase the supply of owner-occupied housing, and the conversion of rental housing to co-op or condo status, which reduces the supply of rental housing, have to be accepted by the Attorney General's office. In 2021, the New York State Attorney General's office approved 220 residential plans containing 4,673 residential units, a 6.4% decrease in plans, but a 5% increase in units. Similar to recent years, a majority of the 2021 plans were for new construction, a total of 183 plans with 4,160 new residential units, and 352 units in 4 plans were for non-eviction conversions, with the remaining 161 units in 33 rehabilitation plans. More than 2/3 of plans accepted were located in Brooklyn, with 67% of the share of accepted co-op and condo plans. And by borough, the most units within these plans were also located in Brooklyn, with 36% of the share of units citywide. As this graph shows, the number of accepted residential units in co-op and condo plans increased in 2021 by 5%. The purple bar represents the proportion of accepted units that are condos, and the green bars are accepted co-op units. In 2021, 99% of all accepted units were condos. This chart shows the fluctuation in the number of housing units newly receiving J51 benefits since 1999. Newly certified J51 units increased 279.5% in 2021, but are at their second lowest level since at least 1988. Not shown here, the increase in the number of rental units, 367.2%, was more than that of owner units, 138.4%. While it was reported in last year's housing supply report that the J51 program had expired for all work completed after June 29, 2020, legislation later extended this date to June 29, 2022. The New York City Department of Buildings tracks the number of buildings which are demolished each year, which increased in 2021 by 9.8% to 1,583 buildings. By borough, Queens had a 29.9% share of demolitions, a rise of 13.5%. Brooklyn had a 34% share of demolitions, a rise of 16.7%. Staten Island accounted for 13.2% share of demolitions, a rise of 8%. The Bronx had a 15.2% share of demolitions, a rise of 1.7%. And Manhattan had the smallest share of buildings demolished, 7.7%, a fall of 8.5%. So in conclusion, the number of building permits increased by 1.8% in 2021 to 19,923 units, and increased by 38.1% in the first quarter of 2022 as compared to the same quarter of 2021. In addition, 5% more residential units were approved for co-ops and condos, a total of 4,673 units. 3.8% fewer units were certified with 421A tax incentives, a total of 9,920 units. While 279.5% more units were rehabilitated with J51 tax incentives, a total of 7,362 units. And demolitions increased 9.8% for a total of 1,543 buildings. Recently released data from the 2021 HVS shows that the rental vacancy rate is 4.54% and 9.4% of rental housing is overcrowded. Thank you, and if you have any questions.
Thanks, Danielle. I have a question. I think this may be in the full report, but what is the trend line on overcrowding? I think you said it was not about 9% in this most recent year that we have data for. How does that compare to the years before?
I don't have the comparison in this year's report. I would have to look at the prior year's report, but the definition of overcrowding changed a little, so it's not directly comparable anyway. The previous iteration of the HVS, the numbers that we had defined overcrowding as more than one person per room, and now it's more than 2 people per bedroom. So it's not exactly comparable, but I can get you the numbers from last year if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Or yeah, maybe for a few years back, just I don't know if we have a chart somewhere, just to have a sense of whether it's getting, if it's getting worse or it's staying the same or it's better. Do you know why census changed the definition of overcrowding? Is there what's the logic behind it?
I don't know. I didn't know.
All right, thank you. Other questions for Danielle?
Yeah, hi. So what are some of the reasons behind the decrease in J51 permits over time? So I mean, it's like there's that I'm curious about, and also with the 421A program, I mean, it's like there's also been a decrease, but I'm curious as to, I mean, it's like what happened between 2017 and 2019 that shows that spike, and is the current decrease just because of sort of COVID plus pipeline exhaustion, or basically what are the reasons for the declines in both of those programs?
Sure. Let me pull up the 421A just so we can look at this. This graph is actually the numbers are accurate. They're the number of units certified within each year. But what's happening starting in 2017 is that there were, following some investigations, it was found that there were units that were getting the 421A, that were taking the 421A benefits. They may have had a temporary certificate, but they were not filing for the final certificate. So buildings were advised that if they did not register for the final certificate, they were going to lose their 421A benefits. And they also had to make sure that they registered with HCR if they were rent stabilized rental units. So a lot of, in the report itself, it goes back to 2017. I think it's the last paragraph where we're talking about 421A. It says exactly how many of these units really should have been in a prior year. So this graph would have been a little more level if everything was in its proper place, but it's not. But in 2020, it was mostly actually the units that were certified. And in 2021, it went back up a little to, I think, 30% of units that were, because of enforcement actions. There was also the 421A program was set to expire after 2016, I think. And there was a rush of units that rushed to certify before that happened. And then it was ultimately renewed, but it was changed. So some of that is units rushing in to get there in time. For J51, I think I can't say for sure, but part of it is probably the changes to the rent stabilization laws that made it harder to get MCIs. And also the program was supposed to expire in 2020. So we did have this little spike in 2021, I think, because people were registering retroactively. But beyond that, I can't really say what's going on. But HCR is going to testify. They might have some more information about the number of MCI applications.
Alex?
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a question regarding vacancy rates. So I was surprised that the rent stabilized vacancy rate's a little bit higher than the non-regulated vacancy rate. And I remember in I think it was this HPD summary of the HVS data that older units and older buildings, I guess circa 73 and above and before, with 6 or more units, had a vacancy rate of something like 3% So I just wonder if the reason that the vacancy rate for rent stabilized housing is basically at parity with non-regulated housing is because of the newer buildings that are rent stabilized because of 421A. And I don't know if there's any way of checking that. And again, I don't know if it's how critical that is to know, but it is surprising that the rent stabilized vacancy rate overall is so high. I'm sorry, the vacancy rate is at parity basically with the rest of the housing stock.
I can ask HPD for more detailed numbers. I'm not sure how detailed they can get because as the sample size gets lower, so if you're talking about just 421A buildings.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, I think you can analyze the HVS data to look at the vacancy rate for the 73 and before. 73 is the cutoff year, right?
Right.
Yeah. So for the 73 buildings and before, older, what is the vacancy rate for them, and what is the vacancy rate for the rest of the rent stabilized housing stock, which I suspect is housing built under these tax incentive programs.
Yeah, I can definitely ask HPD if they can run that. We don't have the data yet, so I can't do anything myself. However, the rent stabilized units are 44% of all rental units. So unless there's a big difference in the private units or something else, it is going to stay close to the overall vacancy rate just because it's making up almost half of them.
Right.
But I can definitely ask HPD if they can give us those numbers.
Danielle, on that point, looking at the slide, I'm kind of confused. If rent stabilized is 4.57 and private non-regulated is 5.29, how could the overall rental vacancy rate be lower than those two figures? What's the other pool of housing that's pulling it down?
Public housing and other subsidized housing.
Project-based Section 8 buildings.
Okay, so they have, well, that kind of makes sense. So theirs are super low.
Those are super low. So
Okay,
it's like 10% of these units, let's say, are super, super low, like 1.5%. And then of the 90% that's remaining, half are rent stabilized, half are private.
got it. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Alex, did you have more to say? I see you have your,
Oh, I'm sorry, meant to take it down, sorry.
Christian?
Yeah, excuse the basic question. I mean, but how accurate do you think the vacancy the vacancy data is in the HVS? I mean, is it self-reported or is there some robustness check? I mean, how accurate is that?
I don't personally feel comfortable answering that question just because I don't work on it directly.
Okay.
There are comprehensive notes and endnotes in the summary. I believe it's all done in person. I have seen some of the way that they ask the questions, and it seems pretty thorough. And it's conducted by the Census Bureau. So I think generally speaking, if the Census Bureau signs off on it, then it's probably pretty accurate. Every number that they give has a margin of error. So they do it to the 90% confidence level. So every number is, up or down 10% basically.
Right, but the piece of information, I mean, it's more like the CPS where they actually do the survey in person rather than self-report, like ACS, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's done in person, but of course the people are still self-reporting. I mean, it's still them, answering all of the information for themselves, but it is done in person.
Okay, thank you.
I would just add that, it's a much larger sample than anything else, like much larger than the American Community Survey and other studies of the housing stock in New York City.
Okay.
Yeah, within New York City, I think that's definitely true.
Shayla?
I just wanted to, we are working on the ground and I see some of the numbers on the vacancies. We are seeing vacancies in buildings, especially during COVID and between the tail end of 2020 to 2021. We were still door knocking and giving people information about the moratorium and work like that. And we started to notice a lot more vacant units, and they were vacant for longer periods. And so I assume both COVID and people not moving because of finances is probably like some of the data that we're also looking at too. Because even in the organizing that we do in a building that, normally would be completely full, 46 units, we found 5 vacant units. And they're in the Bronx, in Highbridge. And, as our staff was doing door knocking, the only reason why I know is because I was looking at data earlier yesterday. And so one of the other things we noticed were bigger buildings, they had a lot less vacancies. And I assume that's just management of being able to move people in and out during a crisis like COVID. But yeah.
Thanks, Shayla. Any other questions for Danielle?
I guess I'll have one other question. In that graph on the building permits, there was 1 year where the number was much, much higher, like 50,000. I think it's in 2015. Do you any know what's going on that year?
I think that's also the 421A getting ready to expire.
Yeah,
People
a
to
lot
get
of
it expired.
developers filed for the permit because this is just filing for the permits. So that a lot of developers filed for the permits and got the bare
Okay,
minimum going because of the upcoming expiration.
yeah, thank you.
Christian?
Yeah. Is it this is sort of a broader question. I mean, it's like, but both in the HVS and also in all of the other data that the RGB uses, is there some way to sort of disaggregate the rest of the rent stabilized units from the, or rather, I mean, it's like take out, I mean, it's like the 421A, I mean, it's like an other sort of tax exemption units from the rest of them so that we can see how the trends differ from one to the other. Would that be possible to do? I mean, it's like, would it be possible to sort of disaggregate the DOF data that way?
I can't answer for the Department of Finance data because I don't work on that report. For the HVS, it may be possible, but I don't have the data yet, but I can ask HPD if there was specific numbers that you wanted with taking the 421A out, like if you gave me the specifics, the rent, income, vacancy rate, whatever it is you were interested in, I can ask them if they can run it.
No, it's just more in general. I mean, just that I just think it would be useful for all of the reports that the RGB looks at to see trends separately for 421A and the rest of the rent stabilized stock. I just think that would be helpful. I mean, in connection to Alex's question, I mean, it's like sort of wondering what does the vacancy rate look like, you know, with the pre-73 units versus post. I mean, it's like I'm interested in just many more trends. I mean, it's like how that's changed. So I was just wondering if it's something that's possible in future reports.
We can definitely look into it. I will say one thing about the post 73. Yes, a lot of them might be 421A units, but there are also units that would have been rent, like let's say Stuytown. Stuytown was rent stabilized. Units went over the cap, they were deregulated, and then because they had a J51, they were re-regulated. Those units, even though, let's say a unit like that was built after 73, but has a J51, it's not necessarily like a luxury 421A building. It's hard to say exactly, but we can certainly look into that.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
We're going to be presenting data later in this meeting that takes a look at pre-74 DOF data in terms of rents,
Yeah.
income, and expense. So yeah, so we'll present that shortly.
Yeah, one other question. So how affordable housing built under the city's programs, especially with the low-income housing tax credit, which is rent stabilized, is that treated as regular rent stabilized housing, or is that in a separate category of other regulated?
I can't say for sure. I'm not familiar enough with the different programs to know which ones have to register under rent stabilization. It would either be in the other regulated category or in the rent stabilized category.
So it could be that would also be in the post 73 rent stabilized housing and going.
Yeah,
along
it's definitely possible. There are programs that I know, but I don't know the name off the top of my head, that do require the rent stabilization that are affordable housing. I just don't know which programs off the top of my head.
So Danielle, I just want to kind of restate what I heard you say, which is it's possible that a program could be in the other regulated category, but follow rent regulation because of its other regulation. Is that correct?
Well, that wasn't what I was saying exactly, but I interpreted the question more to be if there was something built under an affordable housing program, like the low income housing tax credit program, is that unit counted in the other regulated category or in the rent stabilized category? And my answer was, I don't know enough specifically about the parameters for each program to say, you know, this program says the units have to be rent stabilized. This unit, you know, I'm sure they're following some sort of affordability guidelines, but it might be based on your income, 30% of your income, whatever it is. It depends on the particular program as to where it's going to slot in. I just don't know the specifics of each program well enough to say which ones go where, but there are certainly affordable housing units built after 1973 that are rent stabilized.
Thank you. Any more questions for Danielle? Okay, so Andrew, are you going to present the changes report and the additional income and expense data?
Yeah, we're gonna do the changes report next. Brian actually is gonna read through it. I'm gonna do the slides. So,
Okay.
So just give me a moment to set that up.
Thanks, Danielle.
Welcome.
Yes, unfortunately, I'm connected to Zoom through my iPad, but I can't connect through my Mac to do the slideshow itself. But I'll read through it and Andrew will do the slides if that works.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. I'll get started when Andrew adjusts that. Okay.
Wait, hold on 1 second, Brian.
Mhm.
Thanks for bearing with us. Okay, is everyone able to see that?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay, good morning. Rent regulation has been a fixture in New York City's housing market for close to 80 years, although the laws that govern rent-regulated housing have been substantially changed and modified over time. In 2019, passage of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act eliminated some of the ways that apartments could be deregulated. In addition to legislative changes, the existing laws allow for dynamic changes in the regulatory status of a significant portion of the rent-regulated housing stock in any given year. Units enter, exit, or change status within the regulatory system. This report is our annual update of changes to the rent-stabilized housing stock in New York City. These totals do not represent every unit that has been added or subtracted from the stabilized stock, but rather those that have been recorded or registered by various city and state agencies. They represent a floor or minimum count of the actual number of newly regulated and deregulated units in these years. Next slide, please. Since newly constructed or substantially rehabbed units are exempt from rent regulation, increases to the regulated housing stock are often a result of owners placing these new units under rent stabilization in exchange for tax benefits. Programs and events that lead to the addition of stabilized units include the following: the Section 421A tax exemption program, the J51 property tax exemption and abatement program, Articles 11, 14, and 15 of the private housing finance law programs, Mitchell-Lama buyouts, lofts converted to rent stabilized units, rent controlled apartments converting to rent stabilization, as well as other types of additions. Next slide, please. Tax exemption and abatement programs have a significant impact on the inventory of stabilized housing. Apartments newly created with the aid of these programs must typically remain rent stabilized for the duration of their benefits. In 2021, an estimated total of 6,007 units were added to the stabilized housing stock through 421A. That's up 49% from the prior year. The largest proportion of units was in Queens, 42%, followed by Brooklyn with 30%, the Bronx, 24%, and Manhattan, 4%. There were none on Staten Island. According to HCR, the median legal rent of currently registered rent stabilized apartments receiving 421A tax abatements in 2021 was $3,364, up 3% from the prior year. In 2021, 76 units were added to the stabilized stock through the J51 program, up from 67 units added in the prior year. Now the next. Other additions in 2021 included 244 units that were decontrolled and became rent stabilized, 67% more than the 146 units decontrolled the prior year. 11 loft units entered the rent stabilization system compared to 36 in the prior year. There were no Mitchell-Lama rental units that became rent stabilized in 2021, similar to 2020. And finally, Articles 11, 14, and 15 tax incentive programs added 101 units in 2021 compared to none in the prior year. So summing up all the additions, there were a total of 6,439 additions to the stabilized housing stock in 2021, 50% more than the prior year. Of these initially registered rent stabilized apartments, the median legal registered rent was $2,295, a 4% increase from the prior year. Examining the number of stabilized units added by borough, Queens saw the most additions, 40%, followed by Brooklyn with 30%, the Bronx with 23%, and Manhattan with 8%. There were no added units on Staten Island. And now we'll move on to the subtraction of units from rent stabilization. Deregulation of stabilized units occur because of statutory requirements or because of physical changes to residential dwellings. Events and programs that have led to the removal of stabilized units have included high rent, high income deregulation, high rent vacancy deregulation, co-op condo conversions, expiration of 421A and J51 benefits, substantial rehabilitation, conversion to commercial or professional status, as well as other losses to the housing stock, such as through demolitions, condemnations, and apartment mergers. With passage of the, next slide, please. Thanks. With passage of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019, occupied apartments could no longer be deregulated. However, prior to that date, one type of deregulation that was allowed was high rent, high income deregulation. Based on HCR records, high rent, high income deregulation removed 6,662 apartments from rent regulation between 1994 and 2019. High rent vacancy deregulation is also no longer permitted. From 1994 to 2019, there were at least 170,386 units registered with HCR as being deregulated due to high rent vacancy deregulation. Next slide, please. Thanks. Apartments left rent stabilization for other reasons. Co-op condo status conversions, which include both newly converted units as well as stabilized tenants vacating apartments in previously converted buildings, totaled 480 units in 2021, one fewer than the 481 units removed the prior year. Expiration of 421A benefits resulted in the removal of 1,959 units from the stabilization system in 2021, 4% increase over the prior year. The expiration of J51 benefits in 2021 resulted in the removal of 397 units, a 12% increase from the prior year. 158 units were removed from stabilization through substantial rehabilitation, down 10% from the prior year. 2 units were converted to non-residential use, the same number as the prior year. Finally, other losses to the stabilized housing stock, such as the merger of pre-existing units or demolition or condemnations, resulted in 2,428 units removed from the stabilized housing stock in 2021, a 65% increase over the prior year. Summing up the subtractions, at least 5,424 units left stabilization in 2021, an 18% decline from the prior year. By borough, 58% of all units leaving rent stabilization were in Manhattan. Next was Brooklyn with 31%, followed by Queens with 8%, the Bronx with 2%, and Staten Island with fewer than 1% of the units removed from stabilization last year. This table shows the total number of additions and subtractions from all the programs in 2021. It includes the 6,439 additions to the stabilized stock and 5,424 units removed from rent stabilization. The difference between the two results in an estimated net increase of the stabilized housing stock of 1,015 units last year. As shown in the previous slide, the study found an estimated net gain of 1,015 units to the stabilized stock. The great majority of additions to the stabilized stock were the result of 421A tax incentive program, representing 93% of the additions. Meanwhile, the largest source of measured subtractions from the rent stabilized housing stock in 2021 fell into the other category, accounting for 45% of the total decrease. The next largest source of subtractions was from the 421A program, accounting for 36%. This graph shows the estimated annual change in the total number of rent stabilized units each year since 2003, when the RGB first examined this data annually. While this most recent year saw a net increase of 1,015 units, cumulatively since 2003, there's been a loss of at least 103,674 rent stabilized units over the last, I guess, 18 years or 19 years, 18 or 19. Summing up the changes since 1994, the RGB has measured 175,095 additions to the stabilized stock, and at least 321,745 apartments removed from the stabilized stock, resulting in New York City experiencing a cumulative net loss of at least 146,650 rent stabilized housing units over the last 28 years. Thank you. I will now take any questions you may have. Thanks, Andrew, for doing the slides.
Brian, this is obviously not in this report, but do we have it in one of the reports? What percentage of the housing stock is 421A and J51? Do we know what percentage of our rent stabilized housing stock falls in those two categories?
I mean, we know what enters and leaves. I'm not sure if we have a sum of what is currently getting those benefits. We may actually, maybe in the housing supply report.
It might be worth because I think we've been having a lot of questions about 421A. It might be worth getting a sense of proportion. How, what percent? I don't know if it's a large or a small percent. I mean, I know it's relatively small, but it may be worth informing the board what part of the stock that's in, and actually, relatedly, what percentage is in Manhattan versus the outer boroughs.
Actually, since we probably will be able to get that from the HVS, because that we can just anything built after from 1974 forward that's still stabilized would be 421A.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I should be able to get the 421A numbers, but J51, a lot of those units are rent stabilized regardless. So I don't think we're going to be able to narrow down which ones are only J51 because of that are only rent stabilized because of the J51, but 421A, we can try to get a breakdown.
Great. Thank you, Danielle and Brian. Alex, and then Christian.
Yeah, just following up, David, on what you just said. So when you look at the net change and what was it, 175, the number of units have been added to the rent stabilized stock.
Yes, 170 since 1994, 175,000.
Yeah. I think it'd be interesting to know to what degree that is 421A. I suspect it's most of them, but that may be one way of getting at David's question.
Thanks,
Right.
Alex.
We do. I'm sure they are mostly 421A, but we don't know how many have left. We wouldn't know necessarily how many have left since then, unless, like I said, I think the HVS,
Right.
if we know the current number of stabilized units built after 74, or even much later than that, that might be useful.
Thank you. Christian, and then Adon.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of highlighting, I mean, it's like the sort of, it's basically a continuation of the set of questions from before. I mean, it's like just basically realizing that it really would be good to get a disaggregation of all the data for 421A, J51. I mean, it's like, and also the previous stock, just because, when we're talking about long-term trends in the rent stabilized stock, we're really talking about a stock that has not been the same over the decades. The nature of the stock, I mean, the average rent, I mean, it's like everything is very different for 421A than it is for some of the previous stock. So it really would be good to sort of have more of an apples to apples comparison in the reports. I mean, it's just so we can really see what's going on. Because certainly, I mean, it's like also speaking about what tenants are likely to be in these different kinds of stock, the population is going to be very different for the previous rent stabilized stock than it is for 421A, for instance. So anyway, I feel like it would be really of a service to the board to have that disaggregation. Just highlighting my previous comment on this.
Yes, okay.
Adon?
Sure, I completely agree with Christian's previous comments. So I just had a question. In terms of the subtraction from the stock in 2021, it's just kind of jarring to me that the highest number or the category of the highest subtraction at 2,428 units is that other category. And you said that's just merger, demolition, and condemnation. Is that the extent of them?
Right. We do get those numbers grouped from HCR, who coincidentally will be appearing later. They may be, it may be useful to ask that question if you'd like of them later on to get a more detailed analysis. It did strict because we no longer have high rent deregulation. It did
Right.
strike me as the largest category, and so it stands out more now. And it did go up from last year number. I mean, from 2020.
Yeah, but
So
65%.
yeah, and
Okay.
so I would, it would be useful for us as well. You know,
Sure, I'll flag that.
the
Thank you.
HCR if they could explain that further. I apologize. Also, I didn't have my camera on during the presentation, so it's not. It's through my iPad, so it's not ideal. But
No worries at all. Any more questions for Brian? Okay, well, it's great. We're only just a couple of minutes late we will now ask Woody Pascal, the HCR Deputy Commissioner for Rent Administration, and his colleagues are going to be joining him as well. I'll let them introduce themselves. But Woody, as always, we're really grateful that you take the time to come speak with us. It's the information you provide in response to our questions is very helpful to the board, and we're grateful.
Well, thank you very much. And good morning. Again, my name is Woody Pascal, and I am New York State Homes and Community Renewals Office of Deputy, New York State Homes and Community Renewals Deputy Commissioner for the Office of Rent Administration, also known as ORA. First, let me begin by saying thank you on behalf of HCR Commissioner Ruth Ann Visnaskis and everyone at the agency for your continued willingness to serve the people of this great city. We also want to extend a warm welcome to the new members. But before I begin, please let me introduce to you some of my colleagues at ORA who are vital to our operations. First, I'm going to introduce April Gray Gutierrez, who is the Deputy Bureau Chief at the Property Management Bureau. Guy Alba, Assistant Commissioner for Research and Analysis, and my Senior Advisor, Michael Berrios, who works very closely with staff at the RGB. And I want to thank them for all of their hard work and dedicated service. Chairman Reese, members of the board, I thank each and every one of you to allow us to have the opportunity to provide you with an update on recent activities at ORA and for allowing us to be part of the process leading to the promulgation of this year's guidelines for rent-regulated apartments. As you know, our primary mission is to protect the rights of tenants and to ensure that owners comply with the law. Although this has proved to be one of our most challenging responsibilities over the course of the COVID pandemic, we at the Office of Rent Administration have never faltered in our efforts to enforce the laws governing rent regulation. To be clear, we are still living through a very difficult time. But no matter how extraordinary the challenges of today are, ORA's resolve has been to strengthen as we continue to work towards making our state and our city more resilient. Our expertise has enabled us to support tenants and owners through many crises, and today is no different. Our team continues to innovate, learn, strengthen our ability to serve the public. I'm proud of how we've improved the ease and efficiencies of our service platforms, from multi-language translation assistance to providing online access to individual cases and rent records, and enhancing more transparent reporting mechanisms. We continue to inform tenants and owners about their rights and responsibilities under rent regulation, and we've experienced an experienced management team with all the necessary measures in place to keep ORA running without interruption, all while protecting the health and safety of our employees and their families. Among the ways our staff has continued to operate with little interruption, we have continued to work with our partners in government and community-based organizations to attend a series of forums. ORA continues to provide several thousands of rent histories to tenants each month. We continue to meet with tenants and owners by appointment at our local borough rent offices. We have increased information on our website to increase transparency to the public. And most importantly, we continue to process all of our case types. I'd also like to highlight that ORA has nearly 30 documents, including the lease rider, translated into various languages so that tenants can better understand their rights. ORA has continued to work with our partners, New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, the Department of Buildings, the Department of Finance, now the Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement, and New York City's Housing Authority's Section 8 office. Moving forward, it's important that we remain devoted to helping tenants, owners, and our partners navigate the current circumstances. HCR pledges to keep building on what we have learned and to adhere to the belief that our work is essential to helping New Yorkers preserve and improve the homes they live in, thus their quality of lives. And we are confident that we'll continue to make a positive contribution during this crisis. Thanks to all of our dedicated employees and our relationships with interested parties and stakeholders like you. On behalf again of Commissioner Visnauskas and HCR, I wish you success in your difficult deliberations and offer you ORA's continued support and cooperation. Thank you. I'll take questions.
Thank you, Woody. Questions for Woody and his colleagues?
Hey, Woody.
Hello.
Ayla. I just wanted to ask around the rent loss of 2019 and what is DHCR doing? I know that there was some few hearings that we were supposed to have and processes that were supposed to happen as a result of the rent loss that didn't happen because of COVID. And what's the plan to pick that stuff up, that work back up?
We are going to be issuing regulations. We're working on finalizing everything. And I would say that it'll be soon. And we're working to make sure that that happens in the near future.
And then my other question is on data. I feel like for a long time, we had been hearing that you guys were upgrading your system and then COVID sort of hit too. What is the update on your ability to pull data?
That continues to be a work in progress. We are spending a great deal of time and energy and staff resources to bring us into what I call the 21st century.
Is there a timeline? Sorry, I feel like we've been sort of hearing that you guys have been working on this for a long time now.
It has been a long time. It's been several years. We're continuing to work with our vendor to ensure that we get that we move along. I couldn't give you a timeline right now, but I'm hoping it gets done before I retire.
Adon.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Pascal. How are you? So I had a question specifically about some of the MCI data that HCR provided. So I see here, and I'm just trying to pull it back up, that in 2021, there was an increase from 2020, just bear with me, of a pretty significant amount regarding the applications and the amounts that were paid out. Here it is. I think it's under number 23 in what was submitted. So it says that the total amount applied for by owners in 2021 was 246 billion. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And that the amount applied.
Actually, can I jump in? That's 246 million.
Million. Okay, because I see. Okay. So all of the commas are off, and that they should all be less than that, right, Andrew?
Yeah, no, I think it's right. It's 246 million.
246, 212, $369.
Yeah, 369, yeah.
Right, Andrew's correct, it's in the millions, hundreds of millions.
Billions, excuse me. Yeah, 246 million. My
Yeah.
apologies. So, but it said that in 2020, the amount was 65 million. It shows that in 2021, there's 195 dollars that were granted, up from 39. I'm just wondering, because we've been hearing this sort of narrative that the HSTPA had a freezing effect on the applications, and that owners weren't being paid out as much for putting in NCIs. I guess I'm just wondering what 2019 data showed, or pre-2019 data had shown in relation, because it seems like owners are still putting in and applying for and receiving a large portion of the MCI applications that they're putting in for.
April, you want to join in there?
Absolutely. I'd have to get back to you on the numbers from 2019, but if you take the overall explanation, if you realize the change in law in 2019 caused a lot of owners to submit applications before the law was actually, the rent law, HESPA, was approved in 2019. Our belief, at least, is that it appears they thought that the law would not have an effect on their dockets if they submitted them early, which was not necessarily true. But we were also working at a reduced staff level during 2020. And it is likely that that is at least in part responsible for why the numbers look a little off. The other thing is you also have to remember that while it says what the owner applied for and what the agency granted, it's not what was applied for and granted in the same time period. It's kind of a moving target.
Right. So I see. So there's no way to determine when, so for example, the $195 million that was granted in 2021, there's no way to determine any sense of when the applications were filed, other than DHCR telling us that applications generally get determined within 6 to 9 months or 6 to 12 months. Do you understand the question that I'm asking? Like, because what you're telling me is that if it was granted totally or in part in 2021, and that was $195 million, you're saying it doesn't follow that necessarily that money was, that application was put in 2021 and then determined. So is there any way to determine when the actual initial application was put in that would then result in the determination to that number in 2021?
Don, just so I make sure that I understand, is another way of asking your question, what percentage of, for any given year, what percentage of submitted expenses get approved? Is that another variant of the question?
Can you repeat that, David?
What is the percentage of submitted expenses that get approved for any given year? Is that another way of asking the question?
I guess what the question I'm wondering is that, because April, correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that it's a bit of a moving target because the year in which somebody puts an application in doesn't necessarily, like the number.
It's not necessarily reflected in the same year as having been granted or denied.
Right. And so I guess the question is, for example, that 2021 figure of $195 million that was granted, is there a way to determine what percentage of that was applied for in 2021 or applied for in 2020?
I think let me see if I can get this right. I think what you're asking me more or less is, in terms of the applications that we processed and made a decision on in 2021, when did they come in?
Yes, because then you can determine, yes, it factors into the number. Thank you.
All right. So that's really the question, April. When do they come in? Did they come in 19? Did they come in 20? Did they come in 21? What's that number that we made a decision on in 2021?
I'm not sure how we would break that information out. I'd have to go back and actually ask staff if that's a possible thing to be done.
Okay.
And the reason, again, to figure this out is to determine whether or not post 2019, landlords are in fact not seeing large amounts of, of dollars from their applications that they've been pending, because we've been hearing that after 2019, the number of applications have gone down and the numbers potentially being paid out has gone down. But this data, based off of what I'm seeing here, doesn't reflect that to me, particularly when in 2020, there was $65 million applied for, and then $39 million granted. And then subsequently, $195 million were paid out in 2021.
Maybe April, I think, and I get where you're going, but I think April, can you kind of rehash? Because I think the big difference is the cap in terms of owners getting their money back, their investment back. Maybe, can you talk about the cap, the 2% cap?
Sure. The actual, I guess the numbers in and of themselves don't give a good explanation. Although if you go down to D under 26, you actually see the increases that were granted per room per apartment. So I'm sure everybody here knows, but I will briefly overview it. HESPA made a lot of changes to the MCIs. It gave the agency the direction to do a reasonable cost schedule, which we have implemented. It has, there's a 2% cap instead of a 6% cap on the increases that are passed along to the tenants. It's also a temporary MCI expiring 30 years after the time period in which it's granted. As far as the reasonable cost schedule is concerned, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I know that in numerous conversations, we have actually realized that there's not anywhere near the number of applications that we expected to be over those rent increases, or rent application dollar figures. It's all of our MCI's applications are actually fully audited, but in advance, we do, in response to HESPA, we actually do inspections up front of 33% of the applications walking in the door. And it's also changed how we process based on the fact of outstanding hazardous and immediate violations issued by the municipalities, both inside the city and outside the city.
And I want to add this one piece to this, is that there is no retroactivity regarding MCI applications. So if you put an application in 2021 and we made a decision on it in 2022, there is no retroactivity, and it's 60 days. April.
After the date the order is issued.
Bingo. Okay. Thank you.
Don, any follow-up? Yeah.
Not on that. I have a couple other questions, but I'll let others.
Okay. Christina S.
Yeah, my comments were, I was just going to clarify that I think what Don was getting at and what I was hoping for is the filing date, but I think we covered that. So thank you for that. And then the second point is the importance that, please note, these increases are subject to a 2% per annum limitation based on the tenant's rent in any 12-month period. So, where the $195 million figure might seem, it is a huge amount of money. The pass along to the tenant is subject to a 2% per annum limitation based on the tenant's rent in any 12-month period.
Shayla.
Hey, Winnie, I just wanted to ask about now that the rent laws have changed, and it feels like to April's earlier comment, maybe staffing is going to look different of where people spend their time. I was looking at the numbers for rent overcharges and how many get processed, how quickly they get processed. And so I wanted to hear from you all, how are you reassessing staffing to make sure that now that maybe you're having less MCIs come in, thankfully through the law that we fought for, and that the 2% cap is happening and all those things obviously should continue, because folks fought for a really long time to put a strain on MCIs, but those got processed fairly quickly in comparison to like rent overcharge. And the numbers that you all provided say that there were 593 filed, 200 were granted, and there are 3,428 pending. I am assuming those numbers are not anywhere close for MCIs and other ways of increasing rents. And so this is something it's been a sticking point for us for a while. And we've talked about it in the past, but I just want to get clarity from you all. How are you reassessing? Are you doing things differently in order to also, be able to address and process tenant initiated interactions with you all?
I think like many organizations, city, state, federal government, and private businesses, we are all continuing to deal with the effects of COVID. We have had probably the largest number of retirements that in the history of this agency in the last 2 years. We were on what I call a hiring binge. Prior to COVID, we had hired about 90 some odd people. Through attrition, we're losing seasoned veterans, but we are hiring. And right now, in fact, we are hiring now and trying to attract and retain who we have. Every case type is different. And I'd say the amount of work is different. So an MCI application may in fact impact 100 people, or it could impact 11,000 people. Overcharges are unique because it's almost a reworking of what's been going on in that unit. And there are a variety of due process issues that have to be addressed when you're dealing with an overcharge. And what we're seeing is a lot of owners and sometimes tenants have attorneys, and they ask for multiple extensions, which delays the processing of that case. But we are, again, hiring. So Sheila, if you got some folks that that have some housing experience, send them over to us. We'll take them.
Don, I had seen your hand up, but now it's down. Did you?
Well, I have a follow-up to Shayla's question and then a separate question. So Mr. Pascal, in terms of the extension issue, I'm just curious, does HCR have any specific plans to put out any additional guidance on that particular issue? I know in my experience, HCR has given out extensions fairly liberally. I know that there have been complaints on both sides about not necessarily having communication from HCR about whether or not some of those extensions get granted and for how long at times. So I guess if you could speak to that first, that would help. And then I'll follow up with my second question.
And I'm going to ask April to come in right after I finish, but I think the challenge for us is that the courts have basically told us that we have to allow for the process. If someone asks for extension, basically you have to give it to them. It becomes a challenge because you want to move on with these cases. You want to have some final, be able to make a determination. But the courts have kind of pushed us in a direction where we're forced to kind of allow for due process. April?
Yeah, fortunately or unfortunately, that's actually accurate. And I'm not sure. I mean, I know we've made some changes where we will send out a notice saying, yes, your request for an extension is granted. But if you think about it, it's usually a request for a 21-day or 30-day extension. What ends up happening is, no, you don't get a notice that says that. On the final notice, those notices will say there are no additional extensions. In addition to what the courts have said, we also see that if we don't grant the extension and we grant or deny the application, a lot of times it will end up in court and the parties will either settle or it'll come back for a new determination or a different determination or a request that we look at some documentation that either side thought needed to be examined that wasn't. In order to get a final order, our goal is to get it right the first time. So there is some delay, but that is due process. I mean, it's not a delay as in like, oh, it just sat there and nobody did anything. It's a question of due process and both parties being able to get a full hearing on the information that they're submitting for whether it is or is not a rent overcharge. Additionally, the other thing is with the overcharge cases, we also have to look at other cases. It's not just, oh, here's an application. The last tenant's rent was X minus X plus whatever. Please grant me an overcharge. There's also questions of outstanding services orders, outstanding MCIs. There's an entire calculation that has to go into that determination, and a question of whether or not it's willful. So there are a lot of moving pieces also in a rent overcharge case.
April, can you talk briefly about MCIs? Because by statute now, that has changed also in terms of the automatic 60 days that tenants get.
So there's an upfront 60-day period in which the tenants can submit documentation to sort of move the project along quicker. In each case, we actually do the inspections coming in the door in hopes that that works. But, you know, as most people on this meeting know, difference between an overcharge and an MCI is an overcharge may have one or two tenants or one or two or three parties. In an MCI case, you have all the tenants in the building. So even if you give tenant A an extension and you have what you think is a final day, if a different tenant asks for an extension, they have to grant that extension also, which just in some part extends that policy, that period of time before an overcharge or before an MCI is granted. I don't, you know, given that it's no longer retroactive, it's to some degree a moving target because tenants do realize that if they extend that period of time, I don't know if they realize that, I take that back, that the extension will cause it so that the MCI is not retroactive. So if something was filed in 2019 and not processed to 2021, whatever dollar figures the owner would have been allowed to collect before HESPA is no longer available because the MCI becomes effective 60 days later. So there's just different pieces. The overcharge has different pieces that the examiners are looking at.
So I think everyone is in favor of due process. So just back to the question about the extensions, you had said that on the final notice, it says there's no more extensions given. At what point does that usually take effect? Like after how many days in total?
I don't think it's based on a date or a number of days. It's based on how many times
You've requested?
We've requested the information from a party.
Okay. So another question I have about the MCIs, I noticed that in the report that was provided, there was a little bit of a discussion about, I guess the general types of MCIs that are applied for, but then there was also a section about how it's a non-exhaustive list, right? And that on a case-by-case basis, HCR is going to make determinations about what constitutes MCIs and not. I was curious if there were any trends that HCR has noticed post-2019 in the types of what work specifically landlords are seeking MCI approval on. Is there any data or trends you've noticed?
I don't think there are any trends. I think it's basic new installations that are being done or local mandates like local law 11, facade work, roof repairs. I think there's a recent mandate regarding elevators that recently passed that we're seeing owners try to comply and grapple with. Regular stuff, boilers are clearly a big issue. April, are we seeing a downtick on boilers? Because I think offhand?
Offhand, no, I can't answer that.
I'd say it's the regular work.
I don't know if this is just a question based on all of the questions that were being asked before. And it's basically around 421A. I feel like there's this conversation about pulling out 421A from the stock that we're looking at to like help make our determination. Can you all shed some light on what differences you see in that kind, like a 421A building in comparison to a rent rolls and other buildings or generalizations that you can make around the impact that it has or doesn't have on how we should make our decision?
It's hard for us to be able to address that because it's not in our wheelhouse. The Department of Housing Preservation Development is the agency that oversees it with the Department of Finance. We're on what I call the back end of this. Once the building's been developed and there's agreement that has been attached to this building, they register with us. I think every building is different, unique, and HPD approves the rent rolls for these buildings. And I think it's probably better for them to be able to respond to your question on 421A.
Adon?
Would it be possible to provide us with information pre-2020 about the hardship applications that were not filed? Because there was only one that was filed last year and there's 3 currently pending. I'm just trying to get a sense of in like the last decade, how many hardship applications were filed by owners.
Yeah, we can get
Actually, yeah, let me jump in. I'm sorry, Woody, to interrupt, but Adon, we do a memo that takes a look at the information they've given us over the period of time. I think we started in like 2008 asking these questions. So we'll update that and put in the numbers for all those different categories, so you can make a comparison over time.
Sure.
And just for the folks at HCR, realize that we update the numbers of registered units because of late filing. So we have another we do both what you report in the current, the year of 20, for example, 2021, there's a certain amount, but you'll come back next year and that amount will be higher because of registration. Right. So we show that as well. But.
This is not so much a question. I just want to encourage Woody. I know that we've been working together in different capacities for many years, but to encourage the agency to really engage folks in some of the 2019 work that we've been sort of waiting for you all to release dates for hearings or to engage us in this fight. And also want to shout out and acknowledge the many decades of work that went into fighting for these stronger rent laws that I feel like often we see in this context of this board as a maybe nuisance or as something that's taking or detracting from folks. But I just want to uplift all the folks who were going to Albany, engaging you all and your agency to like make the best possible space for tenants to engage with you all. And I also want to acknowledge some of the shifts you guys have made with language access, including meeting with folks who have like aggregate data on like what we're seeing and trends we're seeing and engaging us on that. And so I want to encourage that and also uplift the many advocates, tenants throughout the city who engaged the state to make sure that we had stronger rent laws and to celebrate, to be honest, what we are talking as if is making it harder for owners to do things, but for many decades tenants were struggling, and so it feels like something I just wanted to uplift, that it didn't happen by chance, that we've been engaging both way in the agency in different capacities to make sure that tenants' voices get heard, get seen, and that experience, like from processing applications for rent reductions, overcharges at the same pace that we do other applications. And I will continue to encourage you all to engage us and to work with us to make sure that we're being thoughtful about how we work.
Appreciate that, Sheila. Listen, community is the heart of everything that we do at HCR. And we've heard from not only you and other advocates, we've heard from owner groups that we needed to change. We needed to make adjustments. And I think we are still a work in progress. And we continue to listen to you and try to do better. Listen, we live here too. We go through the same issues and challenges that everybody else goes through. And it's important for us to recognize that times are changing and that we have to be able to provide a better service and to ensure that tenants and owners know what their rights and responsibilities are under the law. We appreciate you. Thank you, Sheila.
More questions for Woody and his colleagues? Okay. Woody, again, thank you so much. And
Thank
Guy
you.
and April and Michael, we really appreciate this. This is a big help to us.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Be well, everyone. See
Be
you
well.
soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, April. All right, Andrew, are we now returning to our income and expense data memo number 2? Is that where we are now?
Correct.
All right, and Brian is going to present, and are you going to do some slides?
Yes.
Great, great. Hey, Brian.
Hi. Okay, I'm ready. When Andrew is to do the presentation, I'll read the slides.
Brian, can you, I'm sorry, not Brian, but can everyone else see the
Yes.
slide? Okay, great.
Okay. Once again, hello. I'll do a brief presentation of our second memo, updating the income and expense study. The first memo analyzed supplemental data from the Department of Finance that group buildings that contain rent stabilized units into categories that range from a minimum of 1 stabilized unit in a building to 100% stabilized units in a building. This follow-up memo, RGB did a similar analysis of buildings, but also analyzed a subset of buildings constructed prior to 1974. To simplify the comparison, buildings for the memo were grouped into 4 main categories. Buildings that contain at least 1 stabilized unit, where we examined buildings from all years as well as pre-74 only buildings. Buildings where 80% or more of residential units are stabilized. We looked at pre-74 buildings only. Buildings where 90% or more of residential units are stabilized. We also looked at only pre-74 buildings. And we looked at buildings where 100% of residential units are stabilized. Both all year buildings built all years and pre-74 buildings. We also break it down by location. Yes?
Brian, yeah, I just want to clarify because I think we're all on the same page, but so effectively this strips out anything that could be a 421A, which speaks a little bit to some of the discussions we've been having, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Table 1 illustrates the proportion of all buildings of any age that are entirely rent stabilized, 100% stabilized, pre-74, 80% or more stabilized, pre-74, 90% or more stabilized, and pre-74, 100% stabilized from left to right. I highlighted 3 parts of the city, Core Manhattan, Upper Manhattan, and Staten Island, where there are any differences in the proportions, and of no more than 3 percentage points in Upper Manhattan between 100% stabilized buildings of any age and those built before 1974. And just a caveat, it is important to note that there are only 85 buildings of any year and only 63 pre-74 buildings that contain at least 1 stabilized unit on Staten Island. Next slide, please.
Sorry.
Oh, yes.
Sorry for the interruption. What is the denominator here?
This is the proportion of buildings that are entirely, this is proportion of buildings by stabilized. This is the proportion in each borough or each neighborhood that are in each of these categories. So for example, 34% of buildings citywide, stabilized, buildings that contain stabilized units are 100% stabilized. You look at the top left number.
Okay, so the denominator is stabilized buildings.
Stabilized buildings, yes.
Stabilized. Okay, so it's not all buildings in the city.
Right.
Right.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yes. This entire memo, like the first one, is entirely buildings that contain at least 1 stabilized units or up to 100% stabilized units, and it excludes buildings that do not contain any stabilized units.
Great. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Brian, do you want to clarify? I haven't seen this, so I don't know the answer myself. Do you want to clarify if the denominator is you made it sound like all rent stabilized buildings, but the denominator, I think, is all pre-74 buildings.
That's the case in the last three categories. I was talking, the first column is all buildings of any age. The second, third, and fourth column are only pre-74 buildings. Sorry, I didn't make that clear. It's a little confusing, I think, to incorporate numbers from the first memo along with this new analysis. It's not easy to explain.
Sorry,
People-
just so that I'm clear, the 100% number is all rent stabilized building regardless of year, and then the
Yes.
other three are only pre, but only buildings that have 80% or
Yes.
more of rent stabilized.
80%, yes, the second column, 80% or more of the units are stabilized. In the third column, 90% or more are stabilized. And in the final column, this is all buildings that are entirely rent stabilized.
So for the Bronx, it's for the all buildings that have rent stabilized, regardless of year, it's 55, and 100% is still 55. So that,
Right.
what
Yeah.
does that say then?
Yeah, that means, basically because there's so few basically excluding buildings built from 74 later are excluding 421A buildings essentially. So because there are so few 421A buildings in the Bronx, I shouldn't say that. There's basically no difference in the proportions except in those three neighborhoods that I highlighted.
So if there was a difference, we would assume then that buildings that were 100% rent stabilized in the Bronx would be, like, we would see a dip in the 100% we would have seen a dip in the 100% pre 1974, right? If that,
Right. Yeah.
so
Just
basically, and maybe I just feel like we've been talking about this for such a long time, and like it feels really clear that 421A doesn't really have an effect the same way in the auto boroughs and it does in Manhattan. Is that like what
Well,
like, could come up with the data?
well, I mean, when we get to the other slides from the memo, you can see more differences in terms of the actual data, in terms of rent, income, costs, and NOI. So I will, we can, if you want to talk about the differences more, we can do that if I can continue.
Brian, just to follow up on Shayla's question though. So my takeaway from this slide, and I want to make sure if I'm getting it right, my takeaway from this slide is that other than in those three highlighted columns, the 100% stabilized stock is the same as the pre-1974 100% stabilized stock. Is that a reasonable interpretation?
If I could chime in again.
Yeah,
21A buildings are only 80%, are only 20% rent stabilized generally. So there are no 100% for rent stabilized 421A buildings.
Got it. Okay. So 421A doesn't show up when we distinguish pre-1974 100% stabilized from all 100% stabilized.
That's my interpretation. I have not seen this memo. This is my first time seeing it, but that's my take on it.
Okay.
So
Just to be clear, we still have the need for, sorry, go ahead, Alex, you had your hand up.
just to be clear about the denominator, I think what this is the buildings with one or more rent stabilized units. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And I guess just so I'm fully understanding, I'm clear. So this actually doesn't like take away the need for us to have the 421A aggregated stuff separately.
Go ahead,
Because
Andrew.
we're not dealing with that at all right now, right? Because we just established that data is not reflected in what we're looking at right now.
No, anything that's pre-74 is not going to include 421A.
No, I know that, but aside from like, even in terms of that first column though, because of what Danielle just said in terms of the percentage of actual rent stabilized units in a 421A building. right?
Well,
we do. I'm sorry, Andrew.
no, the percentage rent are the number of buildings that are that fall into that are 100%. So, 100% stabilized, include that includes all years, right? So 15% of the buildings in Manhattan are 100% stabilized, including all years. And the same for those when we exclude the 421A. But it's not units, it's building.
But isn't it done right, Andrew, that there's no column in which a 421A building would be on this particular slide?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
I could continue if with the next slide. I'm sorry, let me bring it up. Table 2 in the memo, which is too detailed to present in a slide, examines average rent, income costs, and NOI in 2020 per unit per month by location among buildings of any age, and compares them to pre-74 buildings, examining NOI among 100% stabilized buildings. NOI is $508 in core Manhattan pre-74 buildings, compared to $711 among core Manhattan buildings of all ages, a $203 difference. By comparison, among 100% stabilized buildings in the remainder of the city, NOI is $395 in pre-74 buildings, compared to $429 among buildings of all ages, a much smaller $34 difference. Next slide, please.
Wait, I'm sorry, Brian. This is complicated. I just want to make sure we're all kind of pulling what we can from this. So the last 2 bullet points.
Yeah, those are I just pulled out data comparing core Manhattan, or a couple of numbers from core Manhattan versus the rest of the city.
Okay.
The data for all many more categories is in the memo.
Okay.
Table 2, which people can look at, at their leisure, I guess, or now, but it's quite complicated.
Okay, I got it.
Anything away from it. We just concluded that is the most notable difference for this table.
All right, just again, that core Manhattan is its own creature is kind of, I think, my takeaway from this.
Right. Okay, I can go on to the next slide.
Thanks, Brian. Yes, please.
This table 3, breaks down the audited and unaudited cost income ratios in 2020 by citywide, core Manhattan, and the city excluding core Manhattan among buildings containing stabilized units of all ages, and compares them to pre-74 buildings. Among 100% stabilized buildings, there is a greater difference in core Manhattan compared to the rest of the city when examining buildings of all ages versus pre-74 buildings. For example, the unaudited cost income ratio is 65.5% among core Manhattan buildings of all ages, and 70.6% among pre-74 core Manhattan buildings, a 5.1% percentage point difference. And I highlighted these in yellow. In the rest of the city, the unaudited cost income ratio is 66.6% among buildings of all ages, and 68.4% among pre-74 buildings, a smaller 1.8 percentage point difference. These are the numbers highlighted in blue. The next slide, please. Thanks. Table 4 in the memo, which is too complicated to show on the screen. Breaks down average and longitudinal rent, income costs, and NOI changes from 2019 to 2020 per unit per month by location among buildings of any age, and compares them to pre-74 buildings. Among 100% stabilized buildings, there was a greater decline in NOI among core Manhattan buildings compared to the rest of the city, in buildings among both pre-74 and all building ages. In 100% stabilized core Manhattan buildings, NOI fell 25.5% among buildings of all ages and 28.1% among pre-74 buildings, a 2.6 percentage point difference. Meanwhile, in 100% stabilized buildings in the rest of the city, NOI fell 2.2% among buildings of all ages and 2.5% among pre-74 buildings, a smaller 0.3 percentage point difference.
And Brian, the NOI, so understanding the NOI in core Manhattan, that could include ground floor retail or other income as well as rent, right? So,
right.
Yeah,
like we first discussed when I presented the income and expense study, core Manhattan was especially hit hard with NOI falling more than the rest of the city, and it does include retail and any other commercial income, and it's probably makes up a larger amount in core Manhattan than in the remainder of the city.
okay.
The next slide, please. The final table, table 5, breaks down the proportion of distressed properties in 2020 among buildings of any age, containing stabilized units, and compares them to pre-74 buildings in 3 parts of the city: this core Manhattan, the citywide core Manhattan, and the city excluding core Manhattan. Distress rates are a great deal higher among core Manhattan buildings than elsewhere in the city, especially in pre-74 buildings. For example, among 100% stabilized buildings in core Manhattan, the proportion of distressed properties is 13% among buildings of any age versus 16.1% among pre-74 buildings, a 3.1 percentage point difference that's highlighted in yellow. By comparison, among 100% stabilized buildings elsewhere in the city, the proportion of distressed properties is 5.5% among buildings of any age and 5.9% among pre-74 buildings, a 0.4 percentage point difference. That is the final slide and table from the memo. If there are any further questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So I'm just kind of talking this through for myself, but so the pre-1974, actually, the 100% stabilized or the 100% pre-1974 stabilized, they both tell us how the a good swath of the non-421A set of the housing stock is doing. We have no real information about the 421A stock, but that's not necessarily the question we'd originally asked the staff to take a look at. So that's just, I'm just thinking out loud. So, but let me turn it to Alex.
Yeah, I would say it's slightly different topic about 421A. I think I was just looking up something. The older, prior to the change of the 421A program in 2017, I believe all units were subject to rent stabilization. But when the program was reauthorized in 2017, the units were rent stabilized unless they exceeded the high rent threshold, which was something like $2,700. So it's a very complicated picture that some 421A buildings are 100% rent stabilized or could be, but others are not, especially those that were put in place after 2017. And I think it just shows there's a lot of questions we have about 421A and its overall place within the rent stabilized stock.
Chris, I'm sorry, Brian, did you want to say something?
No, I said thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
No, and I just to add to that, there is a difference between the two groups. So clearly there are 100% stabilized buildings built after 74. So because there are differences between the two groups. So I think that speaks to Alex's point.
Oh, actually, Andrew, that is right. I misspoke when I said that. Okay, all right. Christian and then Shayla.
You're muted, Christian.
Christian, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. How does the distress rate that's on slide 7 here compare to previous years? I mean, what's been the trend?
Well, we didn't do this analysis before, so it's really tough to know. I mean, the distress rate overall went up by 1% citywide in the income and expense study, I believe. So, like I said, we didn't do this analysis, so it's tough to say what it was in prior
But
years.
the overall rate, I mean, it's, so how has the overall rate, I mean, I suppose I can go back and look, but just in case you know off the top of your head, I mean, how has it changed over the past 20 years?
There's a graph.
Yeah, there is a graph I could pull up. You want me to do
It's
that?
pretty low, Christian. It's pretty, by historic standards, it's quite low right now and has been for a couple of years at least.
Okay, all right, yeah, that's what I was curious about. I mean, just sort of putting it into context. And also in terms of putting into context, let me go back to the slide here. So again, I mean, maybe put this into context for me. I mean, it's, so I would have expected the delta between the 100% rent stabilized and the lower percentages in terms of the, in terms of the cost to income ratio to be higher. I would have thought that cost to income ratio would be higher. And so I see the delta is like 2.2%, 2.5%. Can you put that into context for me? I mean, it's like, how much higher is that? I mean, how big of a deal is that delta?
I mean, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to explain how
anybody can answer it. Actually,
different
anybody.
It is. Yeah.
So I'm sorry, Shayla. I'm gonna give my 2 cents on this to Christian, and maybe Andrew has a different take on it. But I think historic, so in our last meeting where we met with the owners and tenants, we kind of saw that for the housing stock overall, we had a cost to income ratio that historically over the last 20 or 30 years was between 55% and 65%. And so I would have to say that when we're like up above, and these are the numbers on the slide that Andrew has, the highlighted numbers are unaudited, and the actual is somewhere probably between audited and unaudited. But I think we're crawling for some portions of the stock, these heavily stabilized. My read on this is that we're crawling up, above the historical range. That's how I'm reading this personally. And I don't know if Andrew or others have their own opinions about that.
Yeah, no, I think that it shows that the buildings that are 100% stabilized, whether it's pre or, the ones that are pre-74, it's a higher cost income ratio. I guess that, that's what the data shows. Whether it's a healthy cost to income ratio, I guess is the question. If it falls somewhere between the two, that's the issue. If you're starting to get to 64, 65, 66%, somewhere in there, maybe that's something that's considered unhealthy, but we'd have to, it just shows that there is a difference between that. That's what the data shows. There's a difference between the two.
Okay, yeah, I think that part of what you just said, I mean, it's like about sort of 64, 65, 66 is an unhealthy ratio. So what makes it unhealthy? I mean, it's like, maybe tell me a little bit more about that. I mean, it's like, why is that a red line?
Well, when we first took a look at all the ratio back in the late 60s, it was about 64%. So with the audited numbers, those ratios have primarily been below that 64%. And that continues to be the case with the audited numbers. The unaudited numbers, if we feel like maybe that number falls somewhere in between the two, you may start to get into areas that make it the cost to income ratio starts to be more problematic for owners. Now that depends what they're doing with NOI, obviously. If a big portion of that is going to debt service, that would have a much bigger impact on the building than one that perhaps doesn't have debt service. So it's harder to find what an unhealthy is. It does indicate that it is larger in the that the ratio is higher, not larger, but higher. But there are other factors that would play into it as well.
All right, actually, along those lines, I mean, Robert or Christina, I mean, it's like, could you weigh in on, for instance, I mean, what if cost of income were 80%? What would that do?
Actually, I'll let Robert and Christina go first, but I'd like to respond as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
What if, I'm not sure, Christian, just explain what you're asking again.
I'm just trying to sort of put that, I'm trying to sort of wrap my head around, I mean, it's like how much of an increase in cost to income is something to worry about or not? Because I mean, it's like we're seeing this 2.2% number, we're seeing this 2.5% number. We're seeing that, you know, when this data started to be recorded, I mean, it was a 64% ratio. In the absence of any context, I'm not quite sure whether this is a big deal or not. And so that's why I'm wondering, I mean, it's like, can a landlord live with an 80% cost to income ratio? Or is there something about 64% that is some kind of a red line? I mean, where is the red line, if there is one? I'm just trying to make this data sort of real in terms of what does it actually mean for building operation?
Well, I mean, obviously costs, you know, are increasing, you know, I would say there is a red line. I think that, you know, anything above the 64, the 70 number, David?
I'm going to try to talk about this a little bit like from a lender perspective, maybe, and others can kind of jump in. But so, you know, when a lender is evaluating the health of a building, they look at the debt service coverage ratio, the ratio of income to debt, to make sure there's kind of a cushion of income to cover, you know, kind of unexpected expense, you know, rising expenses and unexpected expenses. And so I personally, I would pull in a couple of data points. One is, you know, Mike Edelman said when they underwrite at M&T, they're thinking that debt service is like, did he say 30%? Or yeah, it was 30%. That was kind of the underwriting, was that the cost of financing typically is underwritten by the lender at about 30%. And Mike also spoke about, they're not looking necessarily to how the building is doing now, but they're thinking about when the building has to refinance at the end of its term, they want to have a healthy debt service coverage ratio. And Mike said that he had some pretty healthy ones in his portfolio, that they were pretty healthy. They were like, I think he said 1.7, but he says if they go down to, 1.2, they're going to start to get worried. And if, other lenders have said if, they would consider a building in distress if it was 1.05 or 1.10. And so I think what we want to think about, and I don't think that, the data we're looking at right now is definitive, but if the costs plus the expected debt service, are really, eating up the entirety of the cash flow of the building, that's worrisome, and that's what we really should be looking at. And so my take is, when we're going above those historic norms, when we're passing the 65%, we have to think about that. That's a serious thing for us to consider. Here, we're just looking at a subset of the population. We're looking at the 100% stabilized and the pre-1974 100% stabilized, and that doesn't mean that we need to speak just to that segment of the housing stock. But a theme that I've been feeling for this year and last year is that's a segment of the housing stock that we really want to focus on. We don't want that segment of the housing stock that doesn't have access to other forms of income to really kind of be starved for the money they need to kind of maintain themselves year after year. So that's kind of my thinking on it, and I'm sure others have their own thoughts. I'm sorry, Christina S. and then Christina D.
Yeah, so at the 70% mark, not including debt service, we're talking, 1/3 goes to debt service, and, fully rent stabilized buildings are completely in the red. That doesn't include if a boiler goes out, right? We're not talking about any major kind of CapEx that might come up. Building needs a new roof. City comes in and says, the fire escapes need replacing, anything like that. Any major capital expense would tip a building owner at those 70% numbers into, very dangerous territory.
Is this just a clarification on what you just said? I mean, it's like, does that include buildings with debt service and those without debt service, or just ones with debt service?
I think you'd be hard pressed to find a building without debt service. But I'm assuming, my example is a building with a mortgage.
I mean, any building without debt service is going to have a much bigger cushion, no question.
Yeah, and then if I can add to that, when we talk about this, it's not covering real estate taxes too, which are huge in New York City, especially for multifamily buildings.
But Christina, wouldn't that be in our cost, that already be baked into the costs, right? The Andrew, is that right? That's already baked into that.
Oh, but I thought if we're talking like when we talk about like the NOI numbers don't.
No. The cost to income ratio includes the real estate. So in that,
Okay.
so if you go with that 68%, that's unaudited for the stabilized 100% buildings, that includes the real estate.
That does include, okay.
Right. So if 30% is going, that would be from the NOI, would be from the debt service.
I was using the NOI.
Right.
Yeah, but then there's still the debt service, there's capital, a well-maintained building should put away $2 to $4 a square foot every year and for capital expenditures that will come up, so that it has that down the road when a new roof needs to be replaced or the boiler. Those are all things that well-run buildings should have in reserves and have that ability to access.
And I think, Christina, I'm agreeing with you, but I think that a lot of lenders and I think a lot of, the Fannie and Freddie loan programs require reserves built into.
Yeah. I've talked to my friends, to people who do underwriting, and they've got the reserves, they've got the debt to income ratio. And those are the underwriting standards.
Alex, were you gonna? I thought I saw a hand, Alex. I'm sorry, Adon, and then Adon.
I guess I'm just a little confused, only because I know we're talking about the pre-war 100% or highly stabilized buildings, right? And I understand, David, what you're saying in terms of feeling concerned about this rise in NOI in the ratio, but I guess it doesn't really address the maintenance concerns in a different way that we've been harping on a lot. Because again, you guys are talking about like the financial kind of maintaining the building, right? But if we're seeing that there is a correlation between the number of violations and issues that tenants are having in pre-war buildings that are highly rent stabilized or with large numbers of rent stabilized units, I don't understand how that isn't the focal point here. Because how do we justify then trying to give such a high increase to sort of stabilize, or I shouldn't use that word, to further maintain financially these buildings when we've seen a trend over years? It's not like if you look at a building right now that meets the criteria that we just established, like high number of rent stabilized units pre-1974 building. If you look at a building right now that has 194 violations in it, it's not like that 194 was a lot less 5 years ago. You know what I'm saying? So I think, again, this is the perspective issue that I have that we take issue with, and especially when you have folks like ANHD, I think that's right, ANHD.
Yep.
Yeah, all the acronyms, saying pretty forcefully and assertively in the testimony that they provided and the materials they provided that the assumption that we're making in terms of the debt lending being put back into these buildings specifically for the housing stock that we're highlighting right here is a very large assumption to make. And so I think unless we're figuring out more data to look at the actual the violations, how well these buildings are being maintained from the tenant perspective, I don't think it's fair to then be talking about the high increases that we're proposing.
Christina S.
So a building owner with 194 violations is certainly on the radar of HPD, the pilot program, AEP. I mean, there are mechanisms for a building owner with 194 violations. There's also a remedy at housing court for 194 building violations. So when we talk about maintaining buildings, there are remedies for building owners who do not maintain their building. And here at the RGB, right, when we're talking about 70% NOI tipping higher as interest rates go up, this is the remedy, right, for rising costs. So we can look at it in two different buckets. there are certainly avenues for tenants who are in need of repairs. And that's the housing court, right? Immediate relief. I mean, how many times have,
I don't know. I mean, I was out there because I don't know what buildings I've organized that get immediate repairs. Even with court orders, we've been in buildings for years trying to get the same basic repairs like painting or basic. So I don't know. I mean, if landlords are struggling and their NOI is getting higher and they can't make do and are not making that 5% profit, they can also open up their books to DHCR and not engage with us to actually, if you look at the data, to increase rents on the most marginalized communities throughout the city. I mean, we're talking about the outer boroughs and increasing rents on those communities. And that is literally the folks who have the lowest income, who make the city run, and mostly immigrant communities. And so if the solution is tenants should get together and sue their landlords, that feels like not a remedy to me at all. And it also feels like we're saying, well, you know, buildings that are in this repair now, we're just going to give them an increase. Tenants can sue them in housing court if they want to fight the repairs. That feels problematic to me.
Yeah, may I just follow up very briefly?
Mr. Don, please.
So I think the other thing, first of all, I hear what you're saying, Christina, in terms of the 194. I was using that as obviously a drastic example, right? We know how AEP works with the city, but even they have their limitations, right? Just like HCR can only do X amount of overcharge complaints and things like that, HPD can only bring X amount of, AEP comprehensive cases. The other thing is it doesn't change the fact that there is, as we've seen, a correlation between some of these older buildings, but also higher number of violations and nothing being done about it, presumably. The third thing is what I think we really need to acknowledge the power dynamics at play here. You're literally saying what needs to be done in order to rectify this. It would be the tenant who there's not a right to counsel for repair cases, right? For maintenance cases. You're asking a tenant who doesn't have information, doesn't have access, is generally disenfranchised, to go to housing court in an unknown system that generally does not work efficiently they might be mad at me saying this, but it works a lot longer than we would like, right? And you're talking about in New York, right? In Manhattan specifically, there's only one part. There's only one courtroom, one part dedicated in housing court to repair issues. And there's, 8 for eviction cases. So my point is just that who are we putting the onus on, and what assumptions are we making about how we should be adjusting rents? Because if we're assuming that, okay, with these debt to income ratios and the costs increasing past the 65%, right, or 60%, that we need to be taking action to raise the rents to account for that so that that these buildings and these owners can maintain financially, I think that's a huge assumption to make, knowing that in the specific type of housing stock we're talking about, they're in actual disrepair and that people are suffering.
Christina S.
yeah, so just with respect to HP proceedings, I mean, the tenant is the person who files the complaint, and they work in conjunction with HPD and HPD inspection. So while they may not have counsel, they do have HPD correlating or verifying whether or not these conditions actually exist. So, that's been my experience with HP proceedings. And perhaps, if there were buildings, that were in need, as you and Sheila described, that the courts would be flooded with HP proceedings. So perhaps, landlords are making capital calls to cover their expenses and actually maintaining their buildings. That could be a supposition that we haven't heard yet, but something that I would certainly advocate for, that most building owners maintain their properties. And at times, if their income doesn't actually cover the cost of running their buildings, they ask their investors to come up with the funds to cover the expenses. So that's a hypothetical that I'm putting out there. And it's actually not so hypothetical because I've seen that experience. And there are remedies for landlords who neglect their buildings.
Adon, I just want to also respond to your first question. I guess we could think about this in two ways. They're both accurate ways, but one is there are bad actors amongst landlords. There's no question. Some people who maybe intentionally are running their buildings poorly to drive people out to convert to some other kind of housing. Although that's probably less so now that HSDPA is passed. But then there's just also the systemic thing like that there is going to be some. I'm not saying we've hit that number, but there's going to be some number where there's not enough income to support the costs of the building. And I think as a board, we just need to be thoughtful about that and say, hey, do we have a sense of where that number is? Are our decisions responsive to that number? And that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. I definitely don't generally think that anybody with a 100% stabilized building is by definition taking bad care of it. There may be some bad actors, and there may be some buildings where they're really short on funds because of maybe bad financial decisions, or they purchased it at a time when the price was high, and that doesn't necessarily mean they deserve special dispensation. But I guess my response to what you're saying is, while they're bad actors, I still think we have a systemic decision to make about the housing stock overall, and then also with a special eye on the 100% stabilized stock. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
Sure. If I just may very quickly, I hear that. I think that to that point, I still don't think we can deny the correlation that exists or that we've seen about some of these older buildings. I also personally just think that, and I think I can speak for many folks in the movement, that there are a lot more bad actors than I think people on this that people give credit for in this city as it pertains to doing repairs and not doing repairs. And then the last thing I'll say is that in terms of the assumptions, right? I think that we need more data, and it's very hard data to get, about whether or not this debt servicing, when particularly in terms of refinancing, how that money is being used, because it paints this picture that's an overblown picture that these owners are really suffering, but we have no way to track what they're doing with some of that refinanced money. That's the only point I'm going to make, and I understand that it's a very difficult problem to solve, but I'll just leave it there.
I mean, David, I think the other thing I wanted to just say is that for personally, we fight to make sure people are living in safe, decent housing. The second piece and the last piece that we sort of categorize it is affordable. And when we often say affordable, we say affordable to whom? And we're talking about the people who currently are living in the places that they are. We knew we were going to see a dip in NOI, not because of COVID necessarily or what's happening financially, but because the rent laws changed. I think that the legislator acknowledged that and knew that this was likely going to be an impact and the RGB was going to be dependent on more as a result. I just don't know if we had the same conversation with the 0%. The sky will fall if we have zeros, and we didn't see the impact the same way. I think this dip in NOI, was expected. And we haven't seen necessarily, to your point earlier, and you said this, that there has been a dip that tells us something is wrong. There's just a dip. And I think that the assumption that we're making is always there's a dip, it's going to get worse. But we don't have that data. And so I think that we're making a decision on what we think will happen. But as a board, we don't tend to behave and look back and say, we overdid it this time. Let's think critically again in future. And, I don't know who the board will, who will be on the board next year, who this administration would appoint. But I think that conversation feels really difficult to me because we're having the conversation for this year. We can have the best of intentions for future years of how we're going to look at the data, but none of us know if we'll be here. And so that to me is irrelevant. I feel like we need to look at what's happening now, make a decision, and future boards will determine what that decision looks like in the future. For us to be preemptively at making assumptions about this dip as if we weren't expecting it and as if we wouldn't have seen it for years before, I think it's a little bit the landlord's calling wolf and us falling for, maybe there's something there. We haven't seen, the data is not telling us there's something there now.
Alex?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is it possible to get data on building violations by rent stabilization status or the percentage of units that are rent stabilized to sort of cross-check the HPD data with the rent stabilization data?
I mean, so Alex, just to understand, that's kind of speaking to Adon's question effectively, like, are they all
Yeah, so
concentrated?
like to what extent are 100% stabilized buildings, experiencing very high levels of, of violations? Are they concentrated in certain areas? I think, because this is a blunt instrument, the citywide change in rents, and not all, and obviously there's a lot of variation in the situations of rent stabilized housing. But I think it would be interesting to see, where these buildings are and how widespread and to what extent we see them in the 100% or 90% stabilized buildings.
Andrew, is that doable? Do you know, or?
I can't comment because we haven't tried to make that match between the two. So, but no, we can certainly look in to see if we can do that.
Presumably, the city Department of Buildings has addresses for buildings with violations, and presumably you could match that with the data we have on rent stabilized buildings. Obviously,
we need a combination. We don't, the DOF information is summarized data. We don't have that list.
Right.
So I can't, right now we can't do that. Like, even if we had the building side, we don't have the other side of it. So that's the issue. We could take all buildings that have a stabilized unit, but that's not necessarily what we want to get at. So we'd have to have some cooperation from DOF to help us out with that.
Alex, would it, and Andrew, and anyone else, would it be interesting to correlate it by like community district, like community districts with high percentage of 100% stabilized and high percentage of violations? Is that interesting, or is that too general?
I think that it would be interesting to cut it in different ways, just because I wonder to what extent violations are a result of finances and how much of it is a result of other factors. For instance, it's like by community board, it would be interesting because it's okay. It's like, to what extent do landlords think it's much more normal to have violations in some neighborhoods versus others where violations may not be as might be challenged more, let's say. So what I think is, it's like there could be other exogenous factors that are not finance related that have to do with violations. So personally, I would be interested in cutting it in different ways depending on what ways it's available. And community boards would be one of those.
I don't know if folks have seen this, but there's a website called Who Owns What, and it allows you to do some of this, not obviously aggregated by community board necessarily, but owners or addresses. So if you search any address in any area, they will tell you all of the buildings owned by that same LLC or address where people mail their rent. And it allows you to do a little bit of that. In that spreadsheet, you'll be able to pull up the portfolio as a whole. I don't know if I can share screen because I don't want to highlight any specific person, so I'm not going to. But in that you can see the portfolio, and you can see when the building was built, violation changes, open violations, the kinds of top complaints that tenants are making. You could also see the owner or the landlord. I think the most interesting part also is that you can see J51, 421A, and any amounts in the last few ACRIS entries. And it gives you a good picture of what's happening. And then in boroughs like the Bronx, where the mom and pop is, I think, not the normality at all by far. Like for folks like who own massive numbers like Chestnut Holdings, the Morgan Group, all of those folks that own large swaths, you could see all of their buildings, and like what's happening in those buildings. So if folks are interested, I think that that's, for me, it's like often when I hear owners present and say, this is my name, I just look them up and see what who's talking to me, because it's all public data and it's all available. I think the other thing to highlight from this is that there's some other overviews in here. So you can see the number of units, how many of those units are rent stabilized. And you can also see open violations and all total violations. And the new addition that they've had over the last few years is evictions. Given that evictions are really difficult for us to track, they do have the number of evictions that have happened in those numbers. This is a tool we use to find out who do we mail letters to when we start HPs, or we're going to do all the work that Christina suggested earlier to like hold landlords accountable. We often go to, ACRIS or HPD. This pulls all of that data together, and it shows it in a map form. So you can actually see where there are specific owners that congregate in a very specific area, and all of their buildings they own are they own blocks or buildings within blocks. You can see all of that sort of happen in real time for you. And it gets updated pretty regularly.
Thanks, Shayla. I have Christina S., then Adon, then Rob.
Yeah, I was just going to add the HPD has a website as well. So Shayla, thanks for encouraging owners or individuals, the public to scrutinize who their landlord is. The same with HPD. So if you go to HPD.nyc, you can see the number of violations on the buildings as well, and the same data, who the managing agent is and so forth.
Adon?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that. So the website that Shayla is referencing, who owns what, that's actually powered by the organization Just Fix. And so if you go to the Just Fix website, you can learn more about them. I think it could be useful for the board at some point to maybe see if we can bring in folks who are doing the data compiling and the cross-referencing and things like that, because that's way above my pay grade. I don't know exactly how they tabulate all of that. But I think it could be a useful tool.
Adon, a couple of years ago, Just Fix released a report, and the staff kind of did their own internal analysis, which they shared with members of the board. I think, Andrew, that we'll be taking a fresh look at that at some point. Am I right in saying that, or?
Yeah, I mean, we could do that. It's a long process. So
I would just say that. Sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
No, I mean, we could sort of take a revisit that, but it's a long process to do. So it would be something that we'd have to do. If we couldn't complete it this season, but it's something that we can take a look at in the future.
Yeah, I was just going to say that that's good to know, David, about that you guys had spoke with folks from Just Fix before. I do know that in the last several years alone, like I want to say the last 3, they've made significant changes. So it would be interesting to see what your perspective or the rest of the board's perspective would be given the changes.
I fully agree. Yeah, I think the issue in terms of from the staff perspective is that they need to kind of recreate the methodology and clean up the data. So it's a big deal, but I agree with you 100%. Rob?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify something, because Shayla had mentioned about living in the here and now, because who knows who's going to be on the board next year and whatnot. But a lot of the data that we're looking at is not here and now data. It's whether it's a year, it's 2 years old. It's not here now, the present. And I get it, because the board is compiling reports from all different angles and whatnot. But we just need to remember that we work with what we got, and we need to focus on that. We need to focus on the data that's here and now.
Just to go back to the website, I wanted to just highlight that they added a new feature in the last, I don't even know if it was last few months, but recently, where you can search by owner. So you can just put the owner name or what you understand their name is, and it will give you the back end. They do, I think the other piece is that the data is updated by them. And so they have at the bottom when the last data, when it was that page was last updated, it does tell you there, and you can look at where they're pulling this data from. in the methodology. All of it is all there and public. And so, if folks want to, look through that to see like how helpful it is or not, but it is like a place where it just pulls together data that's open and updated. So the HPD violations are updated daily. HPD complaints that are open are updated monthly. The DOB are updated daily. The tax lien stuff is updated yearly. And that's mainly because there's not often that many changes. The eviction data comes from the data the ANHD compiled and other coalitions, including the Marshall's data that's daily. And the 421A, the J51 and 421A is updated yearly. And so it is like, it is pretty robust. And I do feel like, and this is just pushback from all of the things I hear when we have close conversations around, these owners are the exceptions. This is not like the what you're saying about housing might be like one owner with bad behavior or a bad actor. This allows you to actually see just the data raw and like make your own decision on like what that looks like. So if you look at addresses in the Bronx, for example, you would see higher violations that you will see in other parts of the city where incomes are just higher. And I think that if the staff can pull that data together to sort of paint that picture for us to understand a little bit better what's going on. I do also want to just recognize that like I think that there's like an assumption that we're making we're having these conversations from the perspective of making tenants or making sure tenants have affordability. I think it's also the assumption that when people double and triple up, it's more expensive for owners. Buildings get deteriorated more. It's not good for anyone. And so the affordability issue benefits everyone, as many owners have said, during COVID, I forgot, I let rent. I didn't ask people to pay this month's rent, or I had an agreement with my tenant. That's not true for most folks living in these massive, in these buildings that are owned by, owners that have thousands of units in a borough, or hundreds of units in that borough. And so I just want to make sure that like the exception of like what repairs are getting done and not, I will tell you from my lived experience, from the data that I've seen, in areas that income is higher, violations don't look the same. And I think that we can't ignore that. And, that is data that's there. And when we're making decisions on whether we're increasing rents, and we're having these conversations about, at first 421A was inflating what the income NOI and the ratios were. We pulled that out, and we're seeing that, the dip that we're seeing was dip that should have been expected based on the rent loss. And so I think we live in the now with the assumption that later and in the past, landlords have had windfalls of like increases that weren't I don't think were merited by what data was being looked at. And so to make an assumption about we think they will be hurting, I think we can say the same thing, that tenants will be displaced, will be homeless. The conversation of people yelling while I was testifying on May 5th, saying, I'm going to go live with you, is because they will go live with someone else. And so I think that we have to figure out what that balance is. And I don't know if the data this year merits the balance that most of the board voted for.
Christina S.
So Sheila, in your advocacy, I think it's been about a decade or 15 years or something that you've been advocating on behalf of tenants. Is that an accurate time frame?
I've been on the board for 9 years alone, so
yeah.
No, I know. I knew it was
now. I knew it was 9, but then I assume you've been at this work for much longer, as I have. And I guess it occurs to me to ask you if you've had any success story where the landlord and the tenant worked together to, I know you don't want to talk about those instances, but I would have to imagine that.
Of course.
Yeah.
And can I highlight the amount of resources we have to be able to have those success stories? So when we sue a landlord in housing court, I have to bring an attorney from another agency, another organization to come, and that attorney has to get paid. to represent those
sure.
tenants. And then we have intake specialists who come and do the intakes for those processes. When we engage HCR, we have tenants knock on their neighbors' doors to get those signatures
Yeah.
on their days off. And so, of course, we are going to see successes. If I didn't see the successes, I probably wouldn't have the job that I have. But I think the successes are on the backs of effort of folks who are hourly workers and who are already struggling, and on the side have to fight to just live with dignity and in safe housing, and be able to afford their housing. So yeah, there are owners who are reactive. I mean, I can even highlight some of them, like Vet Park Cash, who
Or proactive for that matter.
And
I mean,
proactive.
I don't know about the proactive. I haven't experienced a proactive myself.
Well, I have. And that's the thing, because you know, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but yes, there are proactive. I have a bunch of my clients in the Bronx, in Northern Manhattan, that are proactive. They get out there, they're working with their tenants. The tenants say, thank you. You know what? You need some time to pay the rent. Fine. You want something fixed in your apartment? I'll do better than that. I'll replace. I will do and I will upgrade just so you're comfortable. It happens. It really, really happens, and happens a lot more than you think.
And I think that should happen, because that's like what makes, right, the housing, the city we want to live in, when we're working together and making sure that happens. I think the challenges that we often are focused on, like, what is like the one thing that's happening in housing. And I think you can highlight successes that are happening in the Bronx. We've had only an initial meeting with the owner, and the owner says, you know, I didn't know the conditions were that bad. Of course, I'm going to go and fix it. But that's like, right, we still had to engage so many people and so many hours of work of an outside person to get those repairs. And I think that that's often, you know, I would encourage owners to go to their local organizations who are doing organizing in their area and fund those organizations, so that that proactive conversation happens a lot better. We struggle for funding. We have to, like, now with right to counsel, it's going to be a lot harder to do any proactive litigation. And everyone knows that. And that to me feels like really difficult, because we're having a conversation about increasing rents so that landlords can make the repairs that we know they weren't making before we increase the rents, with, you know, to be honest, increases before this iteration of the board before that, that I don't personally consider were merited. And so I do feel like there is like yes, let's highlight the good owners who are doing the good stuff, but there's millions of people. The one success story of a one person that got rent relief from their owner is I don't think is the exception, not the normality. And from my experience, that's like, you know, we're engaging people in a building, we engage the whole building. We're not hearing tenants saying, my owner is working in agreement with me, so we don't have to go through housing court, so I don't miss more days of work, so that I don't have to be more behind on rent. That's not like the normality that we're hearing.
So let me just say it's almost 12:30. I think we've been going long. I don't want to kind of end things prematurely, but you know, we're going to have other opportunities to have conversations. Should we wrap up? I guess I'll ask it as a question.
Yeah, I have to leave.
I'll second it.
Thank you.
All right. So let me do it officially before Andrew yells at me. But do we have a motion to adjourn? I'm sorry, Adon, go ahead.
David, just really quick, because I had realized that I meant to ask HCR the question that I posed to Brian about the demolition, merger, and condemnation due in the subtraction, and I totally forgot. Andrew, is there a way that we can follow up with HCR to get that answer?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll ask if they can break it out, but when they give us the data, it's not broken out. So my guess is they can't. But I will ask. It is a good question. If you take a look at the appendices in the back, you can see the increased number of those. It used to be proportional to the increases of subtractions, but now it's a higher. Obviously, it's nearly half the subtraction, so the proportion is significantly higher. But historically, it's at its high since we've been tracking it. So it's a very good question, but I'll follow up with them to see if they can do.
Thank you.
But I just before we go, just a reminder to folks who are still watching. I know we lost some folks along the way, but 9 a.m. tomorrow we will have the registration open for people who want to participate in our virtual hearing. So just a reminder of that.
Thanks, Andrew. Alex, I think you're about to make a motion. So a motion to adjourn. Do I hear that?
So motion.
That motion. And I think Rob, I think I saw a second from you. Is that correct?
I'll second it.
So thanks everyone for a very thoughtful conversation about this important topic. Talk to you soon.
All right, take care.
Take care.
Everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Take care.